Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today's webinar is going to be going over HIPAA. And today you've got Chris Reddick and Ron Halversen here. And I'm one of the founding partners of Clarity. Clarity is among other things, a enterprise e-commerce and integration platform development company. And as a result of our many different integrations and projects over the years with e-commerce, portals, medical app development, we've done a lot of work with HIPAA, and in particular with security and privacy and dealing with medical organizations, EMR, EHRs. And so today we're going to be walking you through some of the things that we've learned over these 15 years. And I'm going to be going into some of the technical details. And Ron, who is the sales and marketing VP, he's going to be going over all of his experiences. And Ron has an amazing background. And Ron, if maybe you can share just a little bit more about your background than I just did.
Yeah, no problem. So my background actually started technical. So 25 years ago, director of IT, WordPerfect, Novell. And so I was an engineer by trade and then moved into marketing after that. So very technical, but really understand now the business and how technical solutions are affected by and can cost businesses. And so Chris is definitely our technical resource today to really keep us honest and dive into the really technical details of HIPAA. And then I'm here to hopefully talk about and how that applies to your business and how maintaining compliance is something that would be important for you.
So thanks, Ron. And just to get us started, one of the key questions that we hear from clients and even from acquaintances and business partners that we interact with is, what exactly is HIPAA? Really from there, the question is, how does it apply to my organization specifically? One of the things that's really helpful to understand about HIPAA is that unfortunately, it's rather overarching and it does encompass a lot. Okay, so PHI stands for Protected Healthcare Information, and therefore ePHI stands for Electronic Protected Healthcare Information. And with regards to this discussion today, we're going to be getting into some of the nuances and some of the areas that really are related to digital ePHI, digital and software related aspects of this. And so we want to make the point, though, that generally speaking, HIPAA is going to apply significantly, and for most organizations, primarily outside of the online and software side of things. However, when it comes to online presence, mobile applications, websites, or any software integrations, so EMR, EHR systems, internal systems that are holding some of this ePHI data, those are some of the most kind of scary and uninformed areas for many healthcare providers, for many covered entities, as they're called, or CEs. And so ultimately, what we're looking to do with this conversation today is really give you some perspective on what HIPAA is in this context. But we want you to know that technically we could just go down so many different rabbit holes and talk about this for days and days and not completely cover everything. So we do want to call that out so that you know that whether you talk with us offline or you review some of our other detailed webinars or information that we have on HIPAA, we are going to be giving kind of high-level concepts. And so by generalizing some of them, we may not 100% cover all of the nuances. So generally speaking, HIPAA with regards to online and software, it really is comprised of these 4 rules: the privacy, security, enforcement, and breach notification. We're going to go into these in detail and kind of break these apart. And so how does it apply? Well, you kind of need to know how those rules work in order to really get into the weeds. So we're going to kind of break that apart and get into that detail as we go. But one of the things that we can start with is, when does it not apply? When does it not apply to an organization? Well, generally speaking, if there isn't ePHI or just generally PHI data, and there isn't sensitive information that's being stored or transmitted, then HIPAA doesn't apply. And this is pretty general. So Ron, I'd love for you to kind of
Sure.
help maybe bat it back and forth with me here and talk about some scenarios maybe that you see that it doesn't apply for.
Yeah, as a little background, in the 15 years we've been in business, we've done over 1,300 websites, and our largest vertical is medical. So a lot of the information I'll be providing is what I've seen in doing a significant number of these medical websites for many of our clients. And we're happy to talk to you guys at any time about that. But to answer your question specifically, Chris, for example, let's say a client has well, here's a real scenario. One of our clients, they do therapeutic services, right? So for child development services in the first 3 years of their life, they do developmental like occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, things like that. And so we built a website for them a number of years ago, and it was just a simple, non-secure website. It was many years ago when SSLs weren't really even a thing. And so they had that, and it was really a website to help drive business to bring new therapists to work there. So it didn't have to be HIPAA compliant. And so we built the website. It ran really well. Then he had to start doing some SEO, and it started driving a lot of traffic to the website, so much so the patients started coming going, well, hey, can I sign up directly with you rather than being prescribed from a doctor? And they said yes. So the next call to us was, okay, we need to be able to onboard our clients. Well, when they onboard a client, that's obviously going to gather some of this protected information, right? Information about diagnoses and things that might be wrong with their children that they need help with. And so we had to start collecting data. Well, the client didn't have enough money to go back and migrate the website to a whole new HIPAA compliant hosted website and redo the whole website. So one of the things you can do is not store any of the PHI data. So Chris, you know what we did with that client. How would I have a secure onboarding form on this website, however, not violate PHI and store that data?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that might be overwhelming for folks. So there are forms that we can embed that, you can work with a SaaS-based HIPAA form company and embed a form in the site, but the data for the form isn't actually persisted into the website itself. It's persisted into that form provider's data center, essentially. And so they're managing all of the HIPAA compliance through this SaaS-based service. And so we'll talk about this later, but you can essentially get a BAA with them because you'll be referred to, your organization will be referred to as a covered entity, a CE, and you want to get a BAA, a business associate agreement, which is essentially, without going into a lot of detail, it's basically this agreement between the CE and the other providers about what is actually being covered and what is the responsibility of this partner with this HIPAA data. And so anyway, long story short, that's one flavor of doing this. There are many other flavors, but for a simple form, that's a great solution, isn't it?
Yeah. And one thing to really understand about when HIPAA does not apply is that it doesn't apply like people think. I mean, I've seen so many videos and TikToks lately, right? And everybody's just like, you can't ask me my height or weight. You can't ask me my birthday. That's a HIPAA violation, and it's not. People don't understand that HIPAA doesn't apply to us as individuals. For example, I go to the doctor patient portal and I can log in, and as a patient, I can see all of my medical records. I can see my lab test results. I can do anything I want. And if I was applying for life insurance, they may say, hey, we need these lab results or whatever. And I have every right to go into a doctor patient portal, download those files, extracting that PHI information out of that portal, and I can turn around and hand it to anybody I want. And that doesn't violate HIPAA because I own the data. I have the right. What it really protects is the life insurance person could not pick up the phone and call my doctor and say, hey, by the way, can you tell me Ron's last blood results? Because that is protected healthcare information about a patient, and the patient has not given consent to give and distribute that information out. That's why a lot of times if you go to a doc and have to go to a specialist, what do? They refer you to the specialist so you can go and share whatever, and then you have to sign that form that they make you say that you're able to share your information with another doctor, and you have to list that doctor because you're the only one that can share that information. So If anybody asks you for HIPAA, they can ask you anything they want. You don't have to give it, but that does not violate. And that's probably the one thing I hear most from people is they think if somebody asks them any question about their health, that they're violating HIPAA, and that's just not the case.
That's right. And so I think the summary here is that HIPAA doesn't apply if you're not storing this ePHI data, and in particular for online scenarios. In general, this PHI protected healthcare information. And so that's really the bottom line in general. And there are a lot of nuances to this.
Yeah.
But let's get into when it does apply, and let's kind of start by talking about one of the kind of tenets of software and online HIPAA, which is the security rule. So the security rule is pretty. I mean, you can kind of summarize it. It's basically, if you were to just completely summarize it down, it's basically saying that you follow industry best practices to ensure that the data that you're storing is physically secure, it's technically secure, and then because administrators have access to it, there are safeguards so that the administrators have limited access, and there are safeguards to prevent if their accounts get hacked or what have you, their accounts from accessing things without having multi-factor and other forms of authentication. And so it's kind of like we're putting a vault around this data, and we're doing it from a physical perspective, literally. We're doing it from a technical perspective, so kind of digital security. And then we're also making sure that the folks who can access the vault are properly validated before they can get in.
That can even include rules about who gains access and how they assign and give access to other people as well.
That's right. Yeah, and this ultimately ends up resulting in a lot of confusion in the industry about what exactly that means. What is it that security, where does it begin and where does it end? How can you say that your system is meeting these standards of security, the HIPAA security rule? And the reality is technically there isn't a literally 100% kind of, clear-cut compliance audit that the government does. And in their enforcement, it's not literally just make or break one way or the other. The general concept, though, is that data does need to be encrypted at rest. The resources that are in place to set up the physical safeguards need to be, very secure. So generally, this is going to be similar to the level of security that you would see with the payment card industry, PCI DSS, payment card data security standard. And so in addition to the physical security and some of the, like you were saying, Ron, some of this administrative security, on the technical side, there are constantly breaches. Everyone hears about them all the time, where ransomware is taking over, large oil refineries or oil distribution companies, or possibly crippling healthcare organizations directly. Or, there's malware and things like this. People's accounts get hacked into. So this is a real legitimate concern that there need to be actual technical safeguards in place. And probably the best way to look at this is that it's an ongoing effort. In order to ensure that the security rule is met, you're going to want to incorporate ongoing maintenance and patching of whatever software that you have, and actually have a plan and document the plan, and then actually execute on that plan to keep your software up to date. So whenever you have ePHI data directly, or you're working with a vendor that does have that data, you need to make sure that you or the vendor or vendors actually comply with the security rule. And the security rule is, it's ultimately going to be more and more complex if you have a lot more complex scenarios. If you're dealing with a lot more robust sets of data and you're transferring it between different locations, that becomes more complex. So you need to budget and allocate resources based on the complexity. If it's a simple form, like you were saying, Ron, it really needs to be something that is, the company is aware of, the covered entity or the organization is aware of, but they probably don't need to put a huge budget out there. There are some nice SaaS-based offerings, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The thing I always see where our clients make the mistake is they come to us, they ask for a HIPAA compliant website, we put it in place, and off they go. And they're like, great, we're done. And they don't have any of that ongoing stuff. And then they don't necessarily engage us for ongoing maintenance, right? Fortunately, I haven't seen any of our HIPAA compliant sites ever be breached. However, the handful of clients that I have seen in my almost 10 years here that their sites have been hacked, they were sites that we did like 7 years ago, and then they did their own internal maintenance, but they didn't, like you just literally just explained, they didn't stay up on the patches. They didn't have a plan in place. A security officer wasn't assigned to ensure that specific protocols were met. And sure enough, over 6 or 7 years, they either missed a patch or got lazy, and boom, their site got hit, right? So this is much more important because it's not just your information on your website anymore. You're literally talking about the patient's protected by the government laws data, and you have to have a really good plan in place for ongoing maintenance and continued improvements as technology changes. Your securing of this data has to change with it.
That's right. Well said. And there are other details here that you can see in the bullets around logging and some of the other safeguards. But let's continue on, and let's talk about the next kind of tenet, which is the privacy rule. And Ron, I would love for you to just kind of share your thoughts on the privacy rule from a high level for folks.
Right. So I think all of you have been to the dentist or the doctor, and one of the first things they do, when you sign out that first paperwork, one of the papers is you get a copy of their privacy rule, and you have to sign it. You've read it, and I don't think anybody ever reads it. But this is really one of the things, and why they do that is they understand that they're going to collect some protected health information from you as you go in for your appointment. So one of the pieces of paper they give you is a copy of their HIPAA privacy policy, and they have to do that. And you typically either sign your name to the bottom of that. Sometimes they'll have you initial. I've seen both. And that privacy policy states what they can and can't do with your data, right? So like at my dentist office, there's more than one dentist in that office. So one of the things in their privacy policy says, hey, my dentist can share this information with any other person in their office on staff, but they will not share it with anybody outside unless explicit permission's been given. Like when I had to go in for, I just had my wisdom teeth out earlier this year, and they referred me to somebody else, and my dentist had already done all the x-rays and everything like that. So I had to literally sign a form to consent to them releasing, because they're protecting the privacy of my data, to release that data to my orthodontist who took out my teeth, right? So the privacy rule is going to be different for many different organizations depending on how they're collecting the data, what data they're holding, and what they might do with the data. Hospital might have in their policy the ability to share with any doctors that come and practice at their facility, where your general doctor may it only be him and his handful of nurses or physician's assistants, et cetera.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one of the things about the privacy rule is kind of talking about, like you said, Ron, it's kind of notifying the patient. It's making sure that it somewhat ties into the security rule, where we're basically notifying the patient of what their rights are and what we're using and what it's using for, or what we're using it for, as a covered entity and as partners of the covered entity. But we're also doing some other key things with the privacy rule. So it kind of ties back into the security rule, but we're allowing the patient to actually go in and see changes and be able to transport this to another provider securely. So being able to do things like that, where they can actually request to export the data, they can actually request to have the data removed from the system as well. So if you can think of scenarios where there might be ePHI data, and that's a key part of a workflow, business workflow, you want to be able to think about how you can continue to operate that business workflow while literally with full integrity removing that data if a patient requests to remove their data. So they need to be able to have their data removed at will. And sometimes, depending on the use case scenario, sometimes this type of scenario might only really, typically occur with a pretty complex system where someone's interacting quite often. But as you can imagine, if there are any issues and there does need to be a breach notification, if there is a breach of some kind and the sensitive data is leaked, there needs to be a notification to the patients. And so that means that you may have quite a few of them that request to have their data removed from the system. So these are things that need to be baked in up front, and at least, some reasonable plan to be able to deal with that. It doesn't have to necessarily be fully automated, but they do need to have the ability to get their system, get their data out of the system upon request.
That makes sense. So now we've said we're going to secure the data, and now we've said we're going to keep it private, and we've explained the rules on how we're going to keep it private or how we may share it. So what happens when a breach occurs, right? Let's go ahead and dive in a little bit and talk about some of the consequences of HIPAA violations. I saw one a number of years ago, and a company was breached and lost over 100, was it 100 million? Yeah, no, it was over 1 million records that they lost, and they were fined $210 per record that was breached. And so it was literally like a $210 million fine. So it can literally be crippling to a business.
Yeah, it can. And ultimately, the concepts here for the violations are really based around financial and then potentially even criminal. So this is very, very serious. That's really the only way to say it. And ultimately, the main concepts are that the violation from a financial perspective can accrue per instance. So if each record counts as an instance, this could be a significant risk. And a lot of this is based on negligence and, maybe even intent. I mean, hopefully there's never any intention to have a breach or, any violations. But if you look at negligence, what does that mean exactly? Well, I mean, from a just basic understanding of the rules and making sure that you have some of the key aspects in place, if you don't have some of the ongoing outside of the software side of things, pieces of HIPAA in place, that's absolutely negligence for HIPAA compliance. And what are these? Well, there are several pieces of HIPAA that don't include the software and the technical aspects. And so that would be, things like keeping detailed documents and plans for complying with HIPAA, having a HIPAA security officer, being able to actually plan out and run maintenance and basically go through this process of setting up, ongoing audits and reviews. And so anyway, it is a serious commitment if you're going to be directly hosting the HIPAA data. Now, again, if you're working with a partner who is going to be taking on the direct responsibility of hosting the HIPAA data, or they're going to be managing the HIPAA, then your responsibility as a covered entity is to make sure that that's done right. So you have to be able to say and assert that, they are meeting certain requirements and that you've reviewed and that you understand that they are in fact meeting those requirements. And so that would be the negligence side of things. But yeah, I mean, really, at the end of the day, this is also going to impact if there are violations, this is also going to impact the credibility of the organization.
Yeah.
Just like it would if there was any data breach, right?
Yeah, well, and you said something really important a few minutes ago when you were talking about the BAA, and I don't know that everybody fully understood that is their saving grace, because if I went and put my HIPAA compliant doctor patient portal that I had built up on Microsoft Azure in a HIPAA hosting environment and had them provide me a BAA that said they would protect that data, because now the physical and the technical aspects of protecting that data is on them, because they're patching the server. They have to have the eye scanners for the doors. And if somebody comes in and steals that server or breaches that server on their premises, well, then obviously I didn't have anything to do with that breach. So if that breach occurs and the government comes swooping in and starts doing an audit, the first thing you're going to do is produce that BAA and say, I had nothing to do with this. They'll look at it and say, yep, you're right. And now that goes, and Microsoft's going to have to take care of that, or whoever is hosting it. And that's why Chris just a minute ago said something, if you're hosting the data. So that's why sometimes you may want to have a third-party entity who is well known to have a very robust and secure HIPAA offering. You might want to consider having your data stored there.
Yeah, and I would say it's really going to be complicated because, like we were talking about earlier, it's just not going to be, due to the complexity of how the HIPAA is set up. It's not going to be cut and dry, black and white on any of these topics. Yeah. So unfortunately, if there is a violation, most likely, I mean, the covered entity is absolutely going to be responsible, and the BAA, the partners are also going to share in respective responsibility as well. And so this is fundamentally something where, you have to take responsibility for what the outcome is of the HIPAA data. So it is unfortunate that, things happen, and ultimately you do want to work with partners who are treating it, and taking it very seriously.
Agreed.
But with that, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, why don't we go in and why don't you kind of dive in and tell us about securing the data, some of the elements and some of the things that we need to address and consider when securing the data from an architectural perspective.
Absolutely. So really, from a security perspective, there are some key pieces of securing the information that, even if one layer of the onion, if you want to think of it as kind of like a multi-layered process of security, even if one layer is breached, the actual ePHI data isn't going to be breached. And this is really fundamentally critical, just again, to make sure that this information is secure. So the most fundamental thing is that the data, when it's going across the internet, or over API calls, transferring between systems, et cetera, that it needs to be encrypted when it's going across the wire. And that's pretty standard today. You're probably not going to find hardly any communications that aren't encrypted, but you need to make sure that you're working with a provider who's doing that as a baseline. And then whenever the data is stored, typically in some form of persistence layer, like a database, it actually needs to be encrypted at rest as well. And there are many platforms. A great example is Azure SQL, that literally just have a setting where the data can be encrypted at rest, which is awesome. So literally your providers who are working with different hosting configurations, they can use these data persistence layers that as a configuration setting, and you can just think very low cost, they can enable this encryption at rest. So you have encryption when things are going across the wire, and you have encryption at rest. The other thing is, overall, whenever data is accessed, we need to restrict who has access to what data. And so fundamentally, this is something that we can do with multi-factor authentication and roles-based authentication. And so basically what we want to do is essentially enable multi-factor authentication so that whenever a user is logging in to a key role, and you can apply multi-factor authentication for all kinds of different roles, but maybe for a key administrative role, there may be multiple layers of authentication that the user has to go through. And we can look at things like the fingerprint of their machine or the device that they're using to access this data. So this could be a cell phone or a computer, and we can see the IP address and the device information whenever the request is made to access the data. So we can then complete multi-factor authentication, which would be maybe sending them a text and making sure that they received it on the registered device for that user. And then it could also be requesting that they enter, one of the three security phrases. And depending on how secure the data is, maybe there would be yet another step for them to authenticate. And these would all be things that would prevent someone who externally could have gotten access to, one of these layers from penetrating through the administrative logins. But then once they get into the system, we also want to make sure that their roles authorize them to access only the data that they should have access to. So we want to restrict the roles and restrict what access people have based on their roles, so that if something did happen, we can minimize the damage. And so these are really important concepts just as a general rule of thumb. The other things that we can do are set up intrusion detection so that if there is a breach or a potential breach of one layer of security, then we could enable more robust security overall and patching of the system. And then similarly, there's a concept where we can actually conduct white hat security breaches that are intentional, but that don't actually, get into the ePHI data. So we can simulate what a hacker or a organization that's trying to access this data. Typically, it's going to be some form of hacking. What would they do? And then get a detailed report on how to resolve that and reconcile it.
One of the things I've heard a lot about is this thing called tokenization, right? Is that something that you can explain?
Yeah. And tokenization, you're right. It's really popular because it's so powerful. And it's being used not just in HIPAA with PHI data, but also very commonly in the payment card industry, PCI, DSS space, so data security standards that they have to meet. And it's really interesting. But the concept in general is the data that is PHI in this case, or the data that needs to be secured, is directly sent to a vault. And the vault takes that data, and typically a vault is going to be much more high volume of secure data, and therefore the economies of scale are going to go to work for the vault that we're sending this data to. So it's literally a electronic vault, if you want to think of it that way. It's typically going to be through a company like a group like Azure or third-party groups that are providing vaults where we can send information, and they know that we're sending them secure data. So we have authentication credentials, we have unique account information, and then they say, okay, you are who you say you are. We're going to take this secure data. It doesn't get stored anywhere in our system. It goes straight to this vault, and then the vault provider gives us a unique identifier back. And so the information is then permanently stored. You can think of this as a write once, read many, or worm type of access, but it's permanently stored, and it's basically put into this vault. And then all that we're storing in our system is this identifier. And it's really, really helpful to kind of, again, set up additional layers of security. So where would this be used? Again, this would be used with some of the PHI data and just making sure that we have another layer of security. So if all the encryption at rest, if all the intrusion detection and the white hat hacking, all of that doesn't work and someone still gets in, now all they have is this unique identifier. And then they would have to then additionally breach the vault in order to get at that PHI data. So really, really powerful. And we can, you can set up multiple layers of vaulting too. So.
Oh, that makes sense. It's almost kind of like a Dewey Decimal System, right? You can't get to the book. Yes. You only got the number of the book and you can look it up. So it's that's kind of what the token is. That's a great way to explain
it. Yep. Yeah. So along the way, working on all of the various different projects that we've worked on, we have found that there are some really nice software tools and partners that we are glad to recommend. These do change over time. So instead of putting actual links and references directly into our slide deck. What we wanted to point out is that there are different aspects and kind of different parts of the spectrum that these different software tools and partners will cover. And we do provide resources on our website. And we also will be happy to include, at the time of this webinar, some of those latest tools and resources that we're working with in the links in the description section. But generally speaking, what you will want to consider is that there probably is a provider, a software tool, a resource that does some of these things that are complex with regards to HIPAA. Like we were talking about earlier, Ron, with the forms. One of the other ones that we see a lot is the actual kind of back office and kind of non-digital and non-online compliance with HIPAA, right?
Yeah.
And we found some great partners that can help with that.
Yeah, that'll do a lot of the business side. So it'll actually you can walk into it and it'll literally have checklists for you. You can say, who is your security officer? And you're like, wait, I have to have a security officer? And you click on the information icon and it pops up and says the security officer's responsibility is, and it tells you exactly what they have to do and the typical roles in your organization have to do that and what their responsibility are. And then you can record that. So there are partners and tools that we work with that we can not only develop a HIPAA compliant online solution, but then we can work with a client to get their entire organization HIPAA compliant and maintain their HIPAA compliance. So if anything happened, they could produce all of the reports and all of the certifications necessary to show their adherence to the compliancy rules.
That's right. Exactly. So it really pays to work with a provider and a partner that knows these complex details and really does this at scale. And that's really what we want to talk about next, is basically selecting a vendor, selecting someone to work with. And really that's kind of the bottom line, isn't it, Ron? I mean, you don't necessarily want to go for a drive in really bad weather with someone who's just driven 3 or 4 times.
Yeah. And doesn't have snow tires or a 4-wheel drive, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, isn't it safe to say that HIPAA could be considered kind of bad weather, dangerous territory, maybe a very dangerous road to drive on?
Yep.
And so that's really the summary. You want to look for a vendor for any aspect of your HIPAA compliance needs that has specific experience in the areas that you're looking for. And they're actually following these protocols. Are they actually able to say what HIPAA is and comply with it, and show that they have infrastructure in place and partnerships that support some of the areas that they don't have coverage in? Are they willing to sign the BAA and represent their commitment to delivering on the specific area that they say that they're delivering on, etc. And Ron, whenever you've worked with different clients that are using some of these third-party SaaS services, whenever you're talking with them about these vendors, what are some of the other aspects that you like to point out? What are some of the things that you would recommend considering?
Yeah, I mean, HIPAA experience, right, is the big one. Is this their first time doing HIPAA, but we do a lot of security. Well, everybody who builds a website has to secure it. So you can't really say we're security specialists without some meat to that statement, right? So I think the big one that you said is the BAA, because that legally puts them, if a breach occurs and you get sued, it literally puts them in court standing next to you defending what they did, and they're part of securing that data as well. So the BAA is certainly the big one. But the one is, do they really know what they're talking about? Do they understand the different components? I mean, the 4 compliancy rules. What tools do they have in place? Do they have any testimonials? Do they have any sites, or do they have any customers that are HIPAA compliant that you can go look at, right, and see that they're HIPAA compliant? And then, do they offer any ongoing services, or, we can make you a HIPAA compliant website. We'll just throw it on a HIPAA server and it'll encrypt the database and then we'll cut you loose. But then they don't know how to ensure and help you maintain the compliancy. Well, then that kind of just puts you out on the edge of a cliff. And then you're waiting for that impending storm to come swooping in, right? But if you have the BAA, you've got partnerships that typically understand and can continuously support you with your HIPAA compliance, well, then you're building yourself this great foundation that if the storm swoops in, you're not going to get nailed, right? You've got, like you said already numerous times now, that multiple levels of security, like peeling that onion away. They can try all they want, and they'll always try, right? I mean, how many of our clients do we know that had attempted hacks last year, right? But
it's immediate when you go online. I mean, right away, when you take anything online that's public, you can watch the logs and you'll see that it's constantly getting attacked.
Yeah.
Right away.
Oh yeah.
So the attempts are always there. So Ron, just based on your experiences with discussing and talking with potential clients, what are some of the scenarios that you see commonly that do require some detailed work on HIPAA compliance? They may be a lot more robust and complex. They're not just going to be a simple SaaS-based tool that's out there,
right,
that you can just turn on a simple form. What are some of those that you've seen?
Yeah, it's kind of amazing that every one of them are different, right? I mean, we've done mobile health apps where clients can schedule appointments with their doctor and request refills of prescriptions. So there's simple mobile, they call them mHealth apps, right? You've got doctor-patient portals that we've done quite a few. We've got billing portals where they're paying their bills online. And a huge one that we do a lot of, especially with our background in e-commerce, are online pharmacies and HIPAA e-commerce. Right? Because, patient comes in and they order a controlled substance. Now, all of a sudden, Ron ordered Oxy and that's recorded. There's PHI, right? Whether it's a diagnosis or a specific drug related to a person, now we've generated a scenario where we're collecting PHI information and we're storing that. So a lot of times a very difficult one is e-commerce. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because the place where I really see that getting complex, and I don't know how deep we want to go into it here, is kind of with GDPR, right? Because they may come back and want to remove their data, but you as a pharmacy have to still maintain that, hey, I sold this government-controlled Oxy to Ron, back in 2019, and I only gave him, a 1-month supply or something like that. Has to stay. So how does GDPR work with HIPAA and with e-commerce?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a great scenario that's, maybe comparable to, going uphill in the snow on a very narrow road for some vendors. And basically, we have to comply with all of these rules. So one of the big things that I would say is that whenever we're looking at fundamentally e-commerce, it really does boil down to having multiple fail safes and having just kind of this assumption of failure as a mindset to be able to go through and test and validate the security, and not just the security of the software, but also the security of the team and the organization and the mindset of the team that's using these systems and these tools. Because most commonly nowadays, a lot of hacks and breaches are occurring on the kind of softer side of things with the people themselves, with them being hijacked or their accounts being hijacked. But anyway, to your question, GDPR mixed with HIPAA, mixed with e-commerce is kind of like a Venn diagram where you've got to be able to hit the sweet spot. So yeah, I think with GDPR, the big thing is, in many ways, it's more complex or more stringent than HIPAA is. And so being able to essentially present to the user that, hey, this information, that's used on the system, you have the right to select to not put your information in for that. And we need to be able to show the user what that's going to impact if they don't, share certain information. Maybe they won't have the ability to continue online. Maybe they'll need to get in touch and have more of a manual process. We also need to be able to let the end user know that this is the data that we're using, and maybe not necessarily just put all their data out there, but just kind of generally say, these are the areas where your data is being used, and you have the right to remove this data. But we just want to let them know, if you remove your data from the system, we're removing your data, right? So you can't really use it in the e-commerce in the traditional sense. But you're right. I mean, the data does need to be, from a compliance perspective, it needs to meet this kind of narrow Venn diagram sweet spot. So typically what we would do in that scenario, if someone wanted to get rid of their data, but we still need to comply with the prescription tracking information, et cetera, is we are going to be kind of persisting that relative to what the covered entity needs to meet their legal requirements. And what I can tell you is, for pretty much every scenario that gets pretty complicated, it may make sense to actually work with a HIPAA lawyer and make sure that you're actually getting T's crossed and I's dotted properly. I do not pretend to be a lawyer, and I can tell you ultimately that's probably where that goes, depending on what kind of prescription data needs to be persisted versus what kind of data ultimately the lawyer might determine that needs to be removed whenever they request the data removal. Yeah, the capability is there to get rid of the data, but allow the system to still function. So we can, keep information in there about the order and just genericize it, and do things like that get rid of, they kind of sanitize that user's information out of the system, but still allow the EMR or ERP system to function. It just isn't going to be as accurate with that user's data.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've done a lot of different things with that, and it sounds like that might be an upcoming webinar where we start talking about GDPR and the EU and the new California restrictions.
Oh, look at you.
Right?
Yeah.
So one of the things with e-commerce for me, I mean, 99 out of 100 e-commerce deals that I deal with, they have some kind of integration, right? I mean, a doctor-patient portal is no good unless I can attach to either the clinic or the hospital or the doctor's EMR, and I can pull lab results, or I can see the available time slots in my mobile app so I can schedule an appointment with my doctor. So I think one of the things we really should talk about is security and HIPAA compliance with regards to, integrations. What do you think?
Yeah, that's right. And the fundamental there is that now we're making it more complex. It's kind of like we're going uphill in the snow and we're towing a car behind us.
You like the snow, don't you?
I sure do. I have a flair for the dramatic. But yeah, I mean, if you think about the kind of level of complexity, it just adds another layer. And whenever these systems talk to each other, basically it just needs to be secure. And so when this data is going between these systems, it kind of opens up the potential between those systems for there to be a breach. But fundamentally, one of the best ways to deal with that is using classic technologies like point-to-point VPN, and then encryption when the data is in transit and encryption at rest, and then these role-based authorizations, and having a user for the e-commerce or the medical portal that has very restricted access. And in many cases, we'll work with clients to set up an intermediate layer that kind of sits behind the physical infrastructure, the security infrastructure of the internal systems. So that's what the external system will talk to. And then that intermediate system, you could almost think of it as like a caching layer almost. That intermediate system would then only talk to the EMR or EHR system or other back office system. So this is kind of like what we were talking about with the Vault system, where you can tokenize things. You can essentially put intermediate steps in place that the data has to go through that's secure. And this just kind of adds extra layers. You can always think of like having, instead of one rope to pull the car, you have like 10, and they're made of metal. That car is not going down.
Yeah, we did this for another client. I just saw the demo a couple days ago, and basically it was an online pharmaceutical type scenario where they could come in and order controlled substances, but the client couldn't really get in and do much with that data. It actually came into our e-commerce, sent an email into a custom portal, notified the doctor that there was a new prescription ready for approval, and then the doctor could log in, and the doctor and or physician's assistant were the only ones that could actually see the request for the prescriptions, right? And then they could approve those, and then it went back into the fulfillment and said, okay, we need this drug, it needs to go to this address, which isn't necessarily, it's kind of a gray area now in PHI, because it could be, my parents are in an old folks home and the provider there is ordering the drugs and the prescriptions and taking care of them. So the prescription isn't always tied to the person making the order, right? So as long as you go through and tie the person and tie the diagnosis and only allow the doctor or PA to have that information, that's kind of that intermediary layer you're talking about, without exposing additional information to people that may not or deserve or should have access to that type of PHI information. Am I hitting on where you're talking?
Yes, sir. That's exactly right. Yeah, so the integrations are really powerful, and it is just a matter of kind of applying the same core concepts. And, because we offer all of these different variations and we have all of this experience, we did, and this is where we're going to give just a very brief overview, but we did over the years put together our own HIPAA e-commerce and HIPAA medical portal solution that we would love to review among your various options if you are looking at going with one of the more robust HIPAA scenarios and you do need a solution. And Ron, what's your experience been so far when you're talking with folks, evaluating some of these different platforms? What are your thoughts on this solution and kind of what it offers and what it doesn't offer?
Yeah, well, great. I mean, again, I've been here 10 years now, and we've done hundreds of these things. So when they came in, the first thing is that people just don't know how it affects their budget, and it doesn't know how it affects them legally or how it puts them at risk. So typically, they're either way underestimating these, coming in going, oh, so I can just have the last website I had built was 15K, right? I can have one like this. And it's like, oh my gosh, no, So one of the things that I see is, and that we've done with this solution more than anything else, is because we know exactly what you need and we built our solution as a modular architecture, we're able to assemble just the modules you need, right? So people can come in and go, I need an mHealth app. I just need a mobile app that does this, that's integrated with the clinic. Great. We've optimized that. We have a solution exactly for that. I can show you a demo, give you an idea how long that can take, and we can build that. Same thing with, we need a doctor-patient portal that connects not only our hospital, but all 400 hospitals on the West Coast. Great, we can do that too. But the biggest thing is that people just don't know what they don't know. They don't understand how eClinical Works and Epic are so similar, but the integration of those two EMRs could not be different. And it all stems literally from a breach that one of the two of them had over 10 years ago. But since we have to deal with that every day, we know those ins and outs. So more than anything else, again, Chris and I aren't trying to sell you this solution, although we think it's amazing. We're just trying to tell you we've dealt with this. So if nothing else, you're welcome to pick up the phone, give us a call, schedule an appointment, and we're happy to give you some consultation time to talk through the intricacies of HIPAA and at least get you on the right path, even if you're looking at some other solutions and want to know our opinion of those solutions.
That's right. Exactly right. Yeah, we learn a lot by talking with potential customers and really just experts in the field or folks that know nothing. So we welcome any and all of these advantages as we continue to build our knowledge base. And if you think that we can help you, point you in the right direction, that's really going to be our goal with any kind of interactions. And you can reach out to us via our Ask an Expert, or you can set up a time to meet with us via phone, whatever format works. But either way, we hope that you found this valuable today. Really, our goal with these webinars is to provide you with some resources that you can start with and that you can kind of get going into the right direction. And again, if you need any support or you're looking for support, please feel free to reach out to us and get in touch. And until then, Ron?
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Okay. Appreciate your time today, and we'll see you in our next webinar.
Awesome. Thanks, Ron.
Thanks, Chris.